What's up, y'all? Talon here. Today I'm going to be doing a tier list of all the restricteds in Regulation G. The World Championship is of course around the corner, happening on August 16th. There aren't any large grassroots tournaments anymore, so I decided I was going to etch my predictions on the restricted usage at Worlds in stone here with this video, just so that I could, after the fact, say, whether I was right or whether I was wrong about certain restricteds, and of course provide my insight into some of the restricteds, the general state of the metagame right now. As a top 32 finisher at North American Internationals this year, I do feel pretty capable at this format, definitely not a expert, but very well versed, so I'm excited to share my opinions here. If you have any disagreements, let me know in the comments below. Give the video a like if you enjoy, and of course subscribe to the channel if you're interested in more coverage for the World Championship, as well as any Regulation H content for the foreseeable future after the World Championship ends. So with all that being said, I do want to hop into it. Let's start off strong here with Koraidon. I do feel like Koraidon is a B tier pick. Although it has a lot of intrinsic strength, I think Orichalcum Pulse is a very strong ability. The fighting type is definitely very favored against Terapagos, and it's one of the few Pokemon that can beat Zamazenta fairly consistently. I think it's one of Zamazenta's weaker matchups. Unfortunately, Zamazenta isn't the meta-present threat that it used to be, so I do think that hurts Koraidon's usability a little bit. The Orichalcum Pulse setting up Sun is definitely very nice, but generally I feel like you lose the weather wars against things like Kyogre, which are a little bit bulkier and can tank the hits in rain and out of rain. The plentiful light screen, fake out, and generally just like things like Thunder Wave let you beat the Koraidons pretty easily with either Ice Beam or Water Spout or Origin Pulse, depending on if the Koraidon has already burned the Terrifier. So I do feel like Kyogre is looking strong coming into Worlds, and the Koraidon has a pretty weak matchup into Calyrex Ice Rider, which is one of the dominant meta forces, Miraidon, and of course Calyrex Shadow Rider. Those are probably going to be the big three at Worlds, so having a weak matchup into all three is definitely very difficult, even though it has decent matchups into the more fringe restricteds in the format. Next up, we have Miraidon. So I do have Miraidon in the A tier. Some people have it in S, some people have A. Just to give an overview of the tier list, I'm reserving S for the #1 Pokemon in the tier list. I'm not going to order that till probably the end of the video. I guess if you look down below here, we have the Calyrex Ice Rider and the Calyrex Shadow Rider. It's probably going to be one of those, truthfully. I do think that Miraidon is the either second or third best restricted in the format, like by a pretty wide margin. I think the Miraidon teams, first innovated on by Rajan Ball and Aaron Trailer, was a really solid starting point, and it has only gotten better since then. I think the combination of Whimsicott or Grimmsnarl plus Ferrograph and the Miraidon is really, really difficult to handle. The more defensive options with the Grimmsnarl is a new innovation that lets your Miraidon just tank hits a little bit better. It also already has very good natural bulk, but you can get away with not just taking one-hit knockouts, which has allowed people to index more towards the Terra Fairy that covers a lot of the conventional Miraidon counters. So I do think Miraidon has not often been in as good of a spot coming into the World Championship as it is now, so I'm going to put it firmly in the A tier. Next up is Terapagos, which I think has definitely had a weaker season relative to what people thought of it early on. Early on it got second, I believe, the first two regionals, and it had a lot of strength. It could overturn the grassy terrain from Rillaboom, electric terrain from Miraidon, even though I believe it lost to Miraidon in the first final, so that's like not that valuable since you can just Volt Switch away. You just delay the issue until later in the battle, hit a Volt Switch onto them, and then knock them out with Electro Drift after they've popped the Terra. Really, fighting types are its biggest weakness. You can't go for any Terra other than Stellar, which means you always retain your normal typing and are always weak to fighting type moves. One of the top 3 non-restricted in the format is Urshifu. Iron Hand's usage has been on the rise, largely as a result of partially Miraidon, but also it's really good into Terapagos. The only thing I think working for Terapagos coming into this tour is that Zamazenta usage is kind of down relative to what it's been. It's like, not kind of, it's very low in online tournaments. I'm not sure that's going to be representative at Worlds, as I'll talk about later, but I do think Terapagos has had a pretty weak season, and although the Choice Specs and Calm Mind teams are always pretty good, they're never the top tier level that is necessary to win the World Championship. I think this S and A tier is going to be reserved for Pokemon who I think players bringing these have a very solid, like the top users of these Pokemon have a great chance to win the World Championship. And I think even with the strongest pilots, I don't think the Terapagos has a chance to win Worlds this year. Mewtwo, okay, we're kind of at the dregs of the tier list. I think Mewtwo is pretty firmly F tier. It's in almost every way worse than Calyrex Shadow Rider. I don't want to talk too much about it. Lugia, I do actually think is fairly strong. I don't think it's C tier. So C tier would be something where it's like, okay, this is a good Pokemon in theory, but the matchups in the metagame are pretty weak. And then D tier is just like, okay, now we're just matchup fishing. I think Lugia is probably somewhere in the realm of like matchup fishing, truthfully. You're running typically Calm Mind sets, just quick setup, or not quick setup, but kind of slow delayed setup. with Light Screen, Reflect, just try and out-tank your opponents and then sweep in the late game. I've also seen this combination with Annihilate. I think it's Chance Hines who is like one of the innovators of this, but unfortunately I don't think it's that strong of a strategy. You are kind of matchup fishing, and I haven't actually put in the games with Lugia to know what matchup you're fishing for. Maybe Koraidon, maybe some other stuff, but I do think Lugia is kind of a weak restricted. There's a lot of more potent setup Pokemon, namely Calm Mind Terapagos and Nasty Plot Calyrex Shadow Rider, so I do think the niche for Lugia is pretty small, and I don't think many players who are hoping to day 2 or win the World Championship will likely be bringing Lugia. This D tier is kind of just like, okay, this is one of my favorite Pokemon. I think it's going to be kind of fun at Worlds, but not really with a high expectation of making the next day of competition. That's where I have Lugia in the D tier. Next up is its partner Ho-Oh. I do think it's kind of in a similar situation. I think it might actually be a little better than Lugia, just because the extremely high special defense stat, and if you have a cheeky Terra, can maybe help it beat Miraidon if you're like Terra Ground or something cute. The special defense also good against Calyrex Shadow Rider, although some of them are running Psyshock, so it's hard to necessarily say it's going to be very good. But maybe with a Terra Grass to not lose to Urshifu on those teams, you can counter Miraidon a little bit, resist the electric moves, but yeah, I'm not super sold on this Pokemon. I think it's just like better than Lugia, which is not a high bar to clear. Now we have Kyogre, which I think is one of the big surprises of Regulation G. Early on, people thought this Pokemon was kind of just like not cheesy, but just very hyper offensive oriented. You were just going to go with the Mystic Water or the Choice Specs or even the Choice Scarf with Terra Water, have a Serena or something with a Tornadus, and just try and all-out offense your opponents and all that. Though that has a very, very good matchup against things like really just specifically slower restricteds like Calyrex Ice Rider, it's pretty bad against other Tailwind compositions. For example, Calyrex Shadow Rider, Miraidon. Honestly, Koraidon beats those teams in some respects, but also Terapagos just owns these compositions because you get rid of the rain and just like really just tip it down so you can't go for water spouts. The thing that's shifted Kyogre's usage, I think, in the recent months has been Xilang Tang and his team buildings groups, their take with an Assault Vest Kyogre. There's also the one that they brought to the North American International National Championships that Xilang got top 8 and honestly got pretty unlucky in top 8, could have gone a little deeper in my opinion. But this team with the Grimmsnarl with the Light Screen, Reflect, Thunder Wave gives you ways to just extend the battle. There's also a Wo-Chin on there, one of the bulkiest teams in the metagame, and I think an iteration of this team has been going around. It got number 1 on the Battle Stadium ladder in July, I believe, or maybe it was June, by Crystal, got 1st and 3rd on the ladder with Leftovers, Origin Pulse, Ice Beam, Kyogre. I think that's a very strong team as well, although a little more RNG heavy than the Water Spout Assault Vest Kyogre that Xilang and friends brought. I do think the Kyogre is definitely better than Koraidon. The teams are just stronger into the metagame than the Koraidon teams are at the moment. They're just a lot more solidly built. The Koraidon teams very volatile, whereas the Kyogre teams can kind of afford to make a lot of mistakes, can miss a couple moves and still win the battle, whereas the Koraidon teams kind of have to get every trade right and really just make every read correct in the battle, which some players are really strong at. I think like Luca Tregut and a couple Spanish players have definitely proven themselves to be strong pilots of the Pokemon. No telling if they will keep that confidence and bring it to Worlds though. So I think Kyogre at least better than Koraidon. I think it's a toss-up between it and Terapagos. I think Terapagos has been kind of quiet. Yeah, I'll come back to that, but I do think the Terapagos and Kyogre, they're probably kind of tied. If I had to guess, I would not be surprised to see a Terapagos resurgence of some kind. Yeah, not sure if the Calm Mind or Specs Terapagoses are going to outplace the Kyogres. I would bet on the Kyogres, but I could definitely be surprised. It just has felt like the Terapagos teams have been a little bit stale, but I haven't been tracking high ladder especially well after North American International, so I could be wrong on that. Next up is Groudon. I think Groudon, it just doesn't have the finishes to necessitate B tier. I think the weakness is, while Kyogre can at least go for Water Spouts for consistency, Groudon has to run a clear amulet to not get Intimidate cycled, meaning it can't run a better item like Salt Vest or a choice item like Kyogre can, while also having an inaccurate spread move and Precipice Blade, so that just kind of sets it low. The abusers of Photosynthesis and Chlorophyll just pair it better with Koraidon in my opinion, thinking of Venusaur, Flutter Mane, Raging Bolt. Nothing about the ground typing is necessarily that useful for them, whereas the Koraidon's fighting type, just being able to clear out Incineroar very consistently is really nice, as well as being able to go for Flare Blitz with the Orichalcum Pulse boost instead of just the Drought boost that Groudon has. Being able to go for the fire moves into Amoonguss and either force the Terastallization and take a knockout is really nice for Raging Bolt. Amoonguss is pretty annoying for that, even though you can go for Draco, same with Flutter Mane, so I think the Groudon, vastly a superior Sunsetter than Groudon, and I don't really expect to see Groudon going very deep, so I'm going to put it pretty low in the tier list at C. Next is Rayquaza, which did have some usage early on, but just really hasn't gotten any points as far as I'm aware. I think it might have gotten like a 5-4 finish with, what was it, Tropius at North American Internationals. Aside from that, it's been very quiet. I think it's very, very bad against Calyrex Calyrex Shadow Rider. You can go for Terra Normal, I guess, and go for Dragon Ascent. I guess it's like decent against it. Then you're just kind of opening yourself up to Choice Scarf or Shifu. I think it's a very delicate dance to do on the Rayquaza, and it's usually not worth it. It's probably better than Lugia still, though. Better than Ho-Oh. I think so. Honestly, Terra Normal is kind of cool. It's not great against Shadow Rider, but the Miraidon's really bad. It has decent matchups into the top Pokemon, so I think this is kind of like a matchup fishy upper D tier Pokemon, and I think I'll leave it at that. For the Dialgas, I'm not going to differentiate them. I know a lot of people are like, oh, the horse one's better, the other one's better for Trick Room. I don't really care. You're never going to see it anyways, so I think, you know, why quibble? So its main value is Telepathy. It can be next to Earthquake, but Palkia can also do that. I don't really see anyone bringing this to the World Championship in any serious fashion. You're not even matchup fishing at this point. I guess it's like kind of okay against Calyrex Ice Rider with the Steel typing. You can force a Terrestrialization, so maybe it's decent in that regard. I guess I'll put it like bottom of D tier. I think Palkia just has no niche. Honestly, I have never really played into one and been even remotely scared. I don't think it's a very good Pokemon at all in this meta. The typing just isn't that valuable. So I'm going to put it in an F tier. Giratina. I've seen this use like Calm Mind Hex. It's kind of like, you could argue it's matchup fishing, but I don't think anyone very serious is going to be taking Giratina to the World Championship if they're intent on making day 2. Reshiram, kind of in the same boat. I guess it's just like where in F tier we put it. Is it like the Fire Stab is something against Calyrex Ice Rider, I suppose. You can run Ice. You can bait out Draco and go Terra Fairy here. The Kyogre's not great. I don't know. It's probably better than Palkia. It's better than Giratina, but I don't know. Beyond that, Zekrom gotta be better than Giratina, but barely. So you can hit Kyogre for a super effective. You're putting Miraidon in the same situation that Raging Bolt does, but at this point, why aren't you running a Raging Bolt? Speaking of which, like, why does Raging Bolt have similar stats to Dialga? It just feels like Raging Bolt is way better than just the kind of slower mid-speed dragon types here. Weird tangent, but yeah, Raging Bolt is like better than most of these restricteds. So Kyurem White, like, is there really any reason to do this? I guess the ice typing over the Zekrom is like something. You can hit this, but you're just going for dragon moves anyways. You can go for it if yeah, it's bad. Kyurem White, I think is actually is the best Kyurem form, just because you can pair it on a kind of cute Tailwind team. I would probably put it, you're running Assault Vest, you can Blizzard Freeze stuff. It's probably better than Lugia and Ho-Oh, yeah. I'd be more scared of seeing this guy and just getting blizzarded to death. This is better than worse than all the other Kyurems. These guys are not real Pokemon, effectively. Same with this Calyrex form. Solgaleo, I've heard there's some bulldoze stuff you can do with it. Seems cheesy. Yeah, the Palkia is just going to be an Earthquake or an Explosion partner with Telepathy, and you just want the typing over the Steel typing on Dialga for some reason, and then Solgaleo is just like, if we're running a weird bulldoze Pokemon, I guess this is the one we're doing it with. Lunala, I think Lunala is actually sleeper pretty good. It's definitely better than Groudon. There's been a couple of popular Japanese teams, some with Meteor Beam, Lunala, some of them Calm Mind, Terra Fairy, Moonblast, or Dazzling Gleam, plus Moongeist Beam, just not doing the Meteor Beam stuff. I do think this Pokemon actually does really well into Calyrex Ice Rider. Shadow Rider is always kind of like iffy. That's kind of like a setup war, and they usually win in my opinion. You have to build the team very deliberately to beat it. You can beat Miraidon a little bit after a Calm Mind goes up, so it's not that bad. You're okay against Kyogre if they're running Calm Mind, but if they Thunder Wave you, it's not ideal. Pretty good against Terapagos in some respects. I think it's like a decent Pokemon. I think it's probably going to be pretty high on the C tier. So there's this phenomena across the year where I've always just seen top players rate Lunala like so high. People think it's like the bee's knees, particularly like really high players, really high level players just see the potential in this guy. And honestly, I see it. It's always really annoying to play against, but it feels like you just have to work so much harder than your opponent. And I think that's definitely possible. I don't think this Pokemon is matchup fishing necessarily. I'd probably put it like bottom of B tier. It's like the threshold for B tier just because it is very strong, but it does have its matchups where you just have to work way harder, and that's, you know, kind of indicative of B tier. You are good, but you just need to outwork your opponents pretty hard, and that doesn't feel worth it, but it's definitely a Pokemon I could see the right player piloting to day 2 and doing pretty well. Duskmane Necrozma is over here. I've heard this is, again, bulldoze stuff with like Focus-Time Geyser and like Terrifier. I heard Joe saying you could do that. Not good, maybe better than Solgaleo. But yeah, not World Championship contender. I think the Dawnwings Necrozma, though, is actually pretty solid. It's probably going to be C tier just because it's only on one composition and it's like been very stagnant the whole year. It's the Hard Trick Room team with Indeedee Armarouge, or not Indeedee Armarouge. The Armarouge is basically your Dawnwings running Expanding Force, Meteor Beam, and the Moongeist Beam. It's pretty good against some slower teams, or I guess even faster teams if you can reverse the dimensions, but really a lot of World Championship players I expect to be able to handle the established teams. You're kind of matchup fishing at this point and just hoping that you can, roll into someone who didn't prepare the Trick Room matchup, which there's definitely going to be a couple. I could see this team going like X and 3, but I think it's going to take a lot of matchup luck for them to get to an X and 2 and then progress to day 2 at Worlds. So pretty low C tier, but I think definitely, if you're unprepared, very strong. Is it stronger than Groudon? I think no. I don't know. Like a really competent pilot of this team could do it, but I'm not certain. I'm going to go C tier above Groudon. Is that crazy? We'll leave it there. Don't use raw Necrozma. Zacian, easy top of C tier. There's been only like a couple of teams with Zacian that have been very good. I know some people are believers in like Landorus plus Pelipper Zacian. I think that's like a decent composition, but the main issue with Zacian, very, very honest Pokemon. You have to just like outread your opponent, outposition them, and honestly, if like the main offense on your team is usually just going to be a Urshifu water plus rain of some kind plus Tailwind, it's like you're kind of just like relying on Urshifu. It's really just an Urshifu team at that point. I'm not a huge believer in Zacian. I think Kian Campbell is one of the stronger players with it, but beyond that, I'm not really impressed with Zacian. I don't think it's that strong. I think really if I'm picking it, I'm just looking more at the players piloting it, and although there's some strong players on it, I don't really have belief in people outside of them to do well with it. So I think this is a Pokemon that's being carried by the player base, just like their experience with it, more so than the Pokemon actually being that strong in my opinion. So I'm going to put it high C tier. So this might look a little weird, but Clear Amulet Zacian is actually a real Pokemon that has done decently well. I do think it's a little matchup fishy. Would I say it's better than... Would I rather see Clear Amulet Zacian or Rayquaza? Depends on the archetype. I think it might be better than Kyurem White though. So usually you'll see this on a Tailwind team, sometimes with Regidrago it's been seen. I don't think it's like especially strong. The main thing you need to know is the sword item actually does not give Zacian the Intrepid Sword boost. It gets that automatically. Same with the No Shield Zamazenta. So you can run an item like Clear Amulet and still be +1 on the first turn, but you do lose a lot of speed. Suddenly you're not outspeeding Miraidon, but it might be that you can, but you can't run Adamant, you can't run any bulk, and so you're a lot less strong. You lose out on the Steel typing, which is kind of annoying, so not a huge fan, but I do think it has its place on some teams, but again, going to be kind of matchup fishy for most players. Getting towards the end of the list, I think Zamazenta has been very slept on. A lot of people are just looking at online results and saying, okay, this Pokemon stinks. It's like making 0% of them going to day 2, or the few that aren't converting to Top Cut. I think the Iron Defense set is like very bad. I don't think it's good at all. Most of the teams in the metagame are moving too quickly for you to set up, and once you do, you are like taking knockouts on all those support Pokemon, but the restricteds are able to usually take one and answer back and like KO you quick enough for it not to matter. I think the Wide Guard set's very disruptive, and players building around that have been doing pretty well, or have done well at tournaments before, online and in person, and I think there's still a strong contingent of Zamazenta believers. I think their Fiercest Warriors are going to do pretty well. I think it's going to be a strong B tier for me. When I was like pre-planning this tier list a couple weeks ago, I had it as 4th overall above Kyogre someplace. I think that's going to be my most controversial pick. I think Zamazenta is insanely slept on right now. I think the top players are not really playing in online tournaments, truthfully. No disrespect to the people who have been playing with it in tournament, but people like Michael Zhang, and then others just haven't been using it in tournament, whether that's because they don't believe or whether they've just been like kind of cooking in obscurity. I think it's In my opinion, I think it's the latter. I think there's a lot of strong players on Zamazenta who might do well at Worlds. This is probably going to be the take that either looks the best in retrospect or looks the worst, depending on what the results look at. But I think Zamazenta is the 4th best restricted. And yeah, that's where I'm going to stand on it. Zamazenta uncrowned, not very good. So the gimmick here is you can run Grassy Seed instead of the shield item, and you lose a lot of special defense, but you're technically hitting a little bit harder on body press still, while losing the steel typing, which is a pretty important defensive typing. Like, you're no longer neutral to fairy moves from Tera Fairy and Miraidon. They can just swat you right away. But I do think the Grassy Seed Zamazenta kind of matchup fishy, but probably better than Dialga. Better than Lugia? I don't really think so. So yeah, we'll put it there. Eternatus. I think this is, like, again, kind of a matchup fishy Cosmic Power Cheese Pokemon. It's like more stall oriented. It hasn't really done well at tournaments, except I think there's an Eternatus team on the rise. I don't know if anyone will seriously consider taking that to Worlds, but is it better than Rayquaza? Is it better than Clear Amulet Zacian? Definitely not. I think I'll put it, like, probably ahead of Kyurem. I don't think Kyurem... Like, I'd probably be a little more scared of seeing a Eternatus with most teams in the metagame, whereas a Kyurem Ice team is basically just trying to Blizzard Freeze you, whereas the Eternatus team might actually have some stuff and be trying to build proactively to beat you. Okay, last 2 Pokemon. Everyone's been waiting for them. I'm putting the Calorexes both in A tier, obviously, at least. So I said Miraidon was my number 2 or my number 3. Calyrex Ice Rider, easily my favorite restricted Pokemon. This is what I brought to North American Internationals, and there was never a doubt in my mind that it was the strongest restricted Pokemon for me. I do love the balance teams that it's able to bring. The Rain team that was developed very early on. We've seen a lot of iterations of it all be very metagame relevant and extremely strong. Top cutting and even winning some tournaments. The most recent tournament, North American International Championships, won by Calyrex Ice Rider. Shadow Rider really been dominating online due to its strong matchup, in my opinion, against Calyrex Shadow Rider and Miraidon. Decent against Zamazenta, especially when they're Iron Defense, and then people have figured out how to beat Terapagos, which people used to think was an auto loss. I do really think Calyrex Shadow Rider very, very strong, and a lot of the Japanese players have been honing in on it, as well as the European balanced players seem to really like Calyrex Shadow Rider. So with all that being said, I do want to put both of them ahead of Miraidon for sure, but I think at the end of the day, the Pokemon I'm going to be putting in the S tier as the strongest restricted Pokemon at the end of Regulation G is going to be Calyrex Shadow Rider. Although Calyrex Ice Rider, I think in a vacuum, is a stronger Pokemon, I think the metagame is just way worse equipped to beat Calyrex Shadow Rider with Terastallization than it is to beat the Calyrex Ice Rider, whereas with this Pokemon, you can kind of just, like, go into Trick Room and use a Terra Fire. You can really opt your Terra to beat one thing specifically, like Terra Water is really good against GU, Urshifu's, but then you lose to Will-O-Wisp and Incineroar. And you can run Terra Fire on the Calyrex Ice Rider, which is what I ran at NAIC, but then you find yourself very weak to an Urshifu Incineroar combination, which most balanced teams have, which is a very, very difficult combination to handle. I think the Calyrex Shadow Rider teams benefited from a period of lack of use in the metagame. There was a period in the middle of the metagame where people just thought Calyrex Shadow Rider was very bad for some reason, and then it won a regional, and then has done pretty well at tournaments since, especially in the recent online circuit. It has been absolutely dominating. So I do think the Calyrex Shadow Rider teams, in terms of meta development right now, are the team to beat coming into Worlds. Whether they will win or not is, anyone's guess, but I do think that the best, most well-supported, restricted, the best teams in the metagame right now are Calyrex Shadow Rider teams. And honestly, I think actually the Calyrex Ice Rider teams are kind of lagging behind a little bit. I do like the Miraidon a little better going into the World Championship, but it's kind of a toss-up. I think I will put Miraidon a little higher. I do think that the Miraidon is better poised coming into Worlds. And online tournaments has done a lot better. I think Ice Rider is generically stronger, but the peaks, you know what, it's kind of hard to call. I think if there was a meta-dominant Terra Electric or a Miraidon team right now, but people are opting for Terra Fairy on that Pokemon to beat the counters, which is giving it a more even matchup spread, but a lower peak. I do think if there was a peak Terra Electric Miraidon team that was able to figure out how to consistently beat the modern Calyrex Shadow Rider teams, they already have an exemplary matchup against Calyrex Ice Rider if they're not running Rillaboom. But I do think a lot of people are going to be adjusting away from the Incin Amoonguss way of the Calyrex Ice Rider, which was initially very weak to Miraidon. But yeah, I think this is going to be my final tier list. Zamazenta being the unconventional fourth, even though usage is very low for the Zamazenta right now. I think that's probably my most controversial pick. I do think it is a very strong Pokemon, and that's where I feel confident putting it here. So let me know if I got anything wrong. Let me know your top 4. If it deviates from mine a little bit, explain why. Just curious what other people's opinions are coming into the World Championship. Hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you want to see more pre-Worlds content and, mid-Worlds content when it's coming out, please subscribe to the channel. Going to be doing a lot more. Give the video a like, and of course, Regulation H coming out. After that, going to be doing a lot of prep videos for y'all, and for my sake, I will be going to Baltimore Regionals after the World Championship, so stay tuned for that. Hope you guys enjoyed the videos. Please subscribe, and yeah, with all that being said, peace, y'all.